abandoned by her father at birth. Years later, she sang him back without knowing it. Before we dive into today's story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Right here on Cracks of Light, where real emotions meet unforgettable encounters. Now get ready, because what started as a simple song on a subway will take us into a story of love, loss, and fate's quiet redemption. The man didn't notice her at first. He was staring at the window, lost in thought, holding back a sadness that had followed him for years. Daniel had taken the subway that afternoon just to escape, not the crowd, but his thoughts. He hadn't expected anyone to speak to him, let alone sing to him. That's when the small voice rang out. A little girl, barely 10, clutching a bag of medicine and groceries, looked up at him and said, "You look sad, mister. Want me to sing for you?" Without waiting for an answer, she began. Her voice wasn't perfect. 2 front teeth were missing, and her pitch trembled, but the words stopped him cold. "There goes my heart beating, 'cause you are the reason." Daniel's eyes widened. That song, it wasn't just any song. It was the one he and his ex-wife used to call theirs. The one they danced to before everything fell apart. His chest tightened as the little girl kept singing, unaware that her voice was pulling open wounds that had never quite healed. When she finished, people around them clapped softly. But Daniel couldn't move. He simply asked, "What's your name?" "Alina," she smiled, proudly, adjusting the oversized grocery bag. "My mom's sick, so I went to buy her medicine." Daniel stared at her, then at the bag slipping off her shoulder. For a second, he hesitated, but something inside him, something old and broken, stirred. And that's where it all began. Daniel didn't ask why he was doing it. He didn't question why he, a man who usually kept to himself, was now walking beside a little girl he had only just met, holding one of her heavy grocery bags in his left hand while she struggled to balance the other. There was something about her, something in the way she talked, walked, smiled, that stirred something long dormant inside him. Her name, Alina, kept echoing in his head like a melody he couldn't place. She reminded him of something, or someone. As they left the subway station and walked through the quieter side streets, Alina spoke nonstop, as if the silence between them was too much for her. She told him her mother's been sick for days, and how she had learned to boil rice and make soup on her own. She mentioned her mom's favorite shows, how she'd been watching over her, and how she once tried to mix medicine with milk just because the taste was too bitter. She spoke like someone much older than her years, like she had carried too much responsibility too early. Daniel mostly listened. He only nodded, sometimes smiling when she said something unintentionally funny, like how she once tried to wash her own clothes but ended up flooding the bathroom. There was so much light in her, despite the burden. When they reached her building, a small 2-story structure tucked behind a narrow alley, Alina struggled with her key. Daniel watched her fumble, then gently reached out to help. She smiled, thanked him again, and pushed the door open. "Come in," she said casually, like she'd known him for years. "I'll give you the jelly candy I promised." Daniel hesitated at the threshold. The air inside smelled faintly of chamomile tea and fabric softener. The place was small, but neat, one of those homes where everything had a place, not out of wealth but necessity. He stepped in slowly, glancing around, but before he could say anything, Alina let out a small gasp. "Mama!" A weak groan came from the back room. Then came the sound of feet dragging across the floor. Daniel turned just in time to see a woman stumble out of the bedroom, one hand clutching the wall, the other holding her head. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale, but her eyes were still familiar. And as they landed on him, the breath in the room seemed to vanish. "Daniel," she whispered. He froze. "Claire?" He breathed, unable to believe what he was seeing. And then, without warning, Claire collapsed. "Mama!" Alina screamed, dropping the bag and running to her. Daniel moved instantly, catching her before she hit the floor. Her body was feverish, her breathing shallow. He lifted her in his arms, cradling her like he once did years ago, before everything fell apart. He carried her to the worn-out couch and gently laid her down. Alina hovered nearby, tears forming in her eyes. "She's been sick for days," she whispered. "She said it would go away with rest." but it hasn't. Daniel placed a hand on Claire's forehead. Burning. Too hot. He took a deep breath and turned to Alina. Can you bring me a wet towel? She nodded quickly and rushed into the bathroom. As he waited, he stared at Claire's face, unable to wrap his mind around what was happening. It had been 6 years. 6 years since the divorce, since she left the country, since she disappeared from his life without a trace. And now here she was, fevered, weak, and in his arms again. Alina returned and handed him the towel. He carefully dabbed Claire's forehead, whispering softly, as if his voice alone could bring her back to consciousness. It's okay, he murmured. You're safe. Just rest. He looked up at Alina, who was now sitting on the floor beside the couch, hugging her knees. Has she eaten anything today? Alina shook her head. She just drank tea this morning. Then she laid down and told me to go buy food and medicine. Daniel exhaled, his mind racing. Do you have a doctor? We can't afford one, Alina admitted, her voice trembling. I just try to help her feel better. Daniel's heart clenched. He didn't know how or why, but the realization hit him like a tidal wave. This little girl had been caring for her mother like an adult. No child should have to bear that weight. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. I'm calling someone, okay? A doctor. He's a friend of mine. He'll come here soon. You don't have to pay for us, Alina said quickly. I'll find a way. I can sell. Hey, he knelt beside her. You don't have to worry about any of that. Let me help. Please. She nodded slowly, uncertain but hopeful. He stood again and made the call, stepping outside for a moment. As the phone rang, his hand shook. He wasn't sure what was more overwhelming, the fact that Claire was here or the idea that this little girl might be. No, he didn't let the thought finish. Not yet. He needed answers first. He needed time. When he returned inside, Alina had pulled a blanket over her mother and was quietly humming the same song she had sung on the subway. The same song that once meant everything to him and Claire. The weight of the moment nearly brought him to his knees. She always said music helps. Alina said, not looking up. Daniel swallowed hard. Yeah, he whispered. She did. The doctor arrived 20 minutes later. Daniel had known him for years, trusted him with more than a few secrets. Dr. Ocampo ran his tests quickly, checking vitals, asking questions. Claire stirred halfway through, blinking in confusion, then falling back asleep. When the doctor finished, he pulled Daniel aside. She's running a high fever, bordering on dangerous. She's dehydrated, and her immune system is low. But with care, rest, and the right meds, she'll recover. Daniel nodded. Do whatever she needs. After the doctor left, Alina served Daniel a glass of water and a half slice of toast she found in the kitchen. Sorry, she said. We don't have much. Daniel took the toast without hesitation. It's perfect. Thank you. She sat down beside him again. You know, Mama? He hesitated. Yes, a long time ago. What happened? Did you stop being friends? Something in her voice made him look directly at her. She wasn't just asking out of curiosity. She was looking for something deeper, a puzzle piece she hadn't known was missing. We were close. Life got complicated. We went separate ways. Oh, she paused. Well, I'm glad you found us again. He blinked. What? Because when you helped me today, I didn't feel so alone. I think Mama needs that too. Daniel smiled faintly, overwhelmed by the wisdom of her words. I think you're right. That night, he stayed on the couch. Claire drifted in and out of sleep, and Alina curled up beside her. Daniel sat by the window, staring out into the quiet street, trying to make sense of everything. Could this really be happening? Was fate giving him a second chance? More importantly, was Alina his? He remembered the timing. He and Claire had separated 6 years ago. She had gone back to her hometown abroad. She never contacted him again. He had searched for her for a year before giving up, believing she had moved on. But now, standing in this tiny apartment with a child who looked just enough like him to make his heart ache, he wasn't so sure. The next morning, Claire woke up properly for the first time. Her eyes were clearer, though her voice was still weak. When she saw Daniel sitting in her living room, pouring tea, she flinched. Am I dreaming? He looked up. No, I'm here. She sat up slowly, adjusting the blanket over her legs. What were you doing here? Alina sang to me on the train, he said softly. I followed her home. She said her mom was sick. I didn't know. I didn't know it was you. Claire looked away, guilt flashing across her face. I didn't want you to find us. What? I was afraid, she whispered. Afraid you'd take her from me. Or worse, not want her at all. Daniel didn't speak. He walked to her and knelt beside the couch. Claire, is Alina mine? Claire hesitated. Then she nodded, slowly. Yes. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply closed his eyes and whispered, I missed everything. You weren't supposed to, she said. I was going to tell you. But then we fought. And after the divorce, I got scared. Then it was too late. I thought you moved on. I didn't, he said. I tried. But I never stopped looking for you. Claire looked at him, her eyes red. So, what happens now? Daniel looked toward the kitchen, where Alina was humming again, arranging jelly treats in a bowl like they were rare gems. Now, he said, we take care of her. Together. Claire's lips trembled. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Claire was sitting up now, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, trying to piece together the timeline that had unraveled so unexpectedly. Daniel had stayed the entire night without saying much, only checking on her fever, handing her water, adjusting the blanket when she trembled. He hadn't questioned her, hadn't accused. And maybe that's what made it harder. The kindness. The patience. The way he looked at Alina with a kind of longing he wasn't trying to hide. He didn't need to say the words out loud for Claire to know. He already suspected. She had seen it the moment Alina smiled at him. That familiar softness in his face, like he was watching something he once lost and thought he'd never find again. That morning, as Alina helped with the dishes and quietly sang under her breath, Daniel sat across from Claire at the small table. His eyes were tired but focused. I need to ask something, he said finally, his voice low. And I promise, whatever the answer is, I'll handle it with respect. Claire looked at him, her body still weak, her heart thudding against her ribs. She nodded once. Alina, is she? He couldn't finish the sentence. Claire didn't look away. Yes, she said quietly. She's yours. There was a pause, long enough for 100 thoughts to pass silently between them. Then Daniel exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. His hand shook slightly. Why didn't you tell me? I was going to, she whispered. But when I found out, we were already done. I thought you wouldn't want the responsibility. I thought maybe it was better that way. I left, and then everything got harder. I was scared, and when you didn't come looking, I told myself that was the answer. I did look, he said. I spent a year searching. No one knew where you went. And then, I gave up. I figured if you really wanted to disappear, I shouldn't chase. Claire blinked back tears. I was in pain too, Daniel. I wasn't trying to punish you. I just didn't know how to face you with everything I had inside. He nodded slowly. I get it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't push. Instead, later that day, when Claire fell asleep again, Daniel stepped outside to make a quiet call. His old friend from medical school now worked in a diagnostics lab. It wasn't hard to request a paternity test. He didn't tell Claire, not because he didn't trust her, but because he needed to see it written in black and white. He needed something concrete, something that would tell him he wasn't dreaming. The test was arranged discreetly. He brought in a hair strand from Alina's brush and submitted his own DNA. Then he waited. Over the next few days, he continued helping around the apartment. He bought groceries. He cleaned dishes when Claire couldn't get up. He stayed long after most people would have left. Alina, at first wary of this new presence, soon began to gravitate toward him. It started with questions, innocent ones, about his favorite food, his job, his music preferences. Then it shifted to laughter, little jokes at the dinner table. Claire watched quietly as Alina's walls came down, piece by piece, without either of them noticing. One afternoon, Daniel walked Alina home from school. Claire had insisted it was fine, but Alina had smiled wider than usual when he offered. On the way back, she held his hand for the first time. Do you have any kids? She asked. He paused, unsure how to answer. No, just you today. She giggled. That's silly. I'm not yours. He didn't respond. When they got back, Claire was cooking soup on the stove. Alina burst into the kitchen, rambling about her day, the way kids do when they feel completely safe. Daniel leaned against the doorway and just listened. And in that moment, it was all he wanted, to listen, to be there. The call from the clinic came 2 days later. He took it outside, sitting on the old concrete step just beneath the window. The results are in, the text said. 99.9% probability. She's your daughter. Daniel didn't speak. He felt his throat close, his chest swell, something unnameable rising up from deep within. Thank you, he said, voice strained. He didn't go back inside right away. He sat there for a long time, his hands on his knees, letting it sink in. He had a daughter. He had missed her first steps, her first word, her first day of school, all the moments that mattered. But she was here now, and he was here. When he finally stood and went back inside, Alina had fallen asleep on the couch, a book half open on her lap. Claire looked at him from across the room. She knew. You did the test, didn't you? He nodded and he didn't say anything. He just walked over and gently brushed the hair away from Alina's forehead. His hand lingered for a moment. I know, he whispered, and I don't want to miss anything else. Claire sat down slowly, watching him. I'm sorry I kept her from you. He looked at her. I'm not angry. I should be maybe, but I'm not. What are you going to do? I'm not going to force anything. Not on you. Not on her. But I want to be here. I want her to know me, even just as a friend, if that's what you're comfortable with. She deserves that. Claire's eyes welled up. She'll love you. I see it already. That night, they all ate dinner together again. Alina talked about her school project. Claire smiled more than she had in days. And Daniel, he just watched the two of them like a man watching his future walk into the room and sit down. Later, as Claire was folding clothes in the bedroom, Alina peeked in and said, Mom, can I ask you something? Of course, baby. Why does Daniel feel like someone I've known forever? Claire stopped folding. Her breath caught. He's just really nice, right? Alina said quickly. I didn't mean anything weird. It's just, he makes me feel safe, like he's supposed to be here. Claire knelt in front of her daughter and tucked a lock of hair behind her ear. Some people are meant to come into our lives, she said softly. Maybe they were always part of our story. We just didn't see it at first. Alina smiled and hugged her. I hope he stays. I hope so too, Claire whispered. And from the hallway, Daniel, who had paused when he heard Alina's voice, closed his eyes and smiled, just a little. It was the sound of laughter that Rachel heard first, not the soft, distant kind. This was full, genuine laughter. A child's and a man's. Familiar. She stood outside the small apartment, arms folded, a smug twist already forming in the corner of her mouth. She knocked twice. No one responded, so she knocked harder, louder, more entitled. Moments later, the door opened and Claire appeared, slightly flushed from cooking, her hair loosely tied back. The moment she saw who was at the door, her smile vanished. Rachel, she said flatly, what are you doing here? Rachel stepped in without being invited. Wow, this is where you ended up. She glanced around with thinly veiled disgust. Charming, in a tragic sort of way. Claire didn't move. Her body tensed. You need to leave. Rachel smirked and dropped her purse on the counter. Relax. I'm not here to fight. Just thought I'd check in. You know, after all these years, curiosity gets the better of you. And imagine my surprise when I find out Daniel's been playing house in this. What is this, a storage closet? You're not welcome here, Claire repeated, her voice tighter. From the living room, Alina's voice rang out. Mom, is someone there? Claire stepped halfway into the hallway. Stay in the room, sweetheart, she called back gently, then turned back to Rachel. You need to go before I lose what little patience I still have for you. Rachel shrugged, walking further in. I'm just saying, Claire, you always had that martyr complex. But even I didn't think you'd drag a kid into it. She's yours, right? That little one. She scoffed. Poor girl. Growing up in a dump like this with a mother who can't let go of the past. Claire took a step forward. Say one more thing about my daughter, she said in a voice that now shook. Not with fear, but fury. Oh, come on. Rachel rolled her eyes. You kept Daniel's kid a secret all this time? Wow, that's a new level of manipulative, even for you. Claire's fists clenched at her sides. Her voice dropped lower. Daniel knows, and he's here because he wants to be something you wouldn't understand. Rachel let out a harsh laugh. Oh, honey, he's with you because he feels guilty. That's what Daniel does. He saves strays. The slap of cold water against Rachel's face cut her off mid-sentence. Claire stood still, arm extended, holding the nearly empty cup she had grabbed from the kitchen counter without thinking. Water dripped from Rachel's hair, her mouth open in shock. "You smug, self-absorbed parasite," Claire said, breathing heavily. "You don't get to come into my home and insult my child. You don't get to speak her name, and you don't get to pretend like you know anything about what it took for me to survive." Rachel wiped her face, still stunned. "You're crazy." "No," Claire said, voice firm, unwavering. "I'm a mother, and if you ever talk about my daughter like that again, I won't stop at water." Just then, Alina appeared in the hallway, eyes wide. "Mom!" Rachel laughed dryly. "There she is, the golden child." Claire stepped in front of Alina, so fast Rachel barely saw her move. "You're done here," she said. "Get out." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of keys turning in the door silenced her. Daniel stepped in and immediately sensed the tension. He took one look at Claire's soaked blouse, the water puddle on the floor, Rachel's damp hair, and Alina peeking out from behind her mother, and the pieces came together. "Rachel," he said coldly, "what are you doing here?" Rachel smiled sweetly. "Just saying hello. Reminiscing. You didn't tell me you were back in touch with your ex, or that you had a daughter." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're crossing lines you have no right to." "Oh, please. Don't act like you're so noble now. You and I, we had our fun." "It was a mistake," Daniel snapped. "One I paid for every day since. You don't belong here." Rachel's face darkened. "You really think this is going to work? You think playing daddy in this sad little life is going to fix everything?" Claire stepped forward, her voice razor sharp. "I may be broke. I may live in a small apartment and live paycheck to paycheck. But my daughter knows love. She knows honesty. And that means more than any fancy watch or luxury car you ever flaunted in front of Daniel." Rachel turned to Daniel, trying to recover. "So that's it? You're choosing this over everything else?" Daniel looked at Claire, then at Alina, who now stepped fully into view, standing tall, eyes locked on him. "It's not a choice," he said. "It's clarity. You should go." Rachel's mouth twitched. She looked at Claire one last time. "You'll regret this." Claire smiled, calm now. "No, you're the only regret I've ever had the strength to fix." Rachel grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The silence afterward was thick. Claire turned to Alina, crouching to meet her eye level. "Are you okay?" Alina nodded slowly. "Who was that lady?" Daniel stepped in gently. "Someone who used to be in our lives, but not anymore." Claire touched Alina's cheek. "I won't let anyone talk to you like that again. Ever." Alina leaned into her. "I know, Mom." Daniel watched them quietly, then knelt beside them. "I'm sorry I brought that chaos into your world," he said. "If I had known," Claire interrupted him. "It's not on you. Rachel was a chapter that should have ended long ago. I closed it today." Daniel looked at her, eyes soft. "You didn't just close it. You tore the page out." Claire chuckled. "I had to. For her." That night, after Alina had gone to bed, Claire and Daniel sat on the balcony, sharing a quiet cup of tea. There was no need for more explanation. No need to dig into old wounds. Claire had made her position clear, not just to Rachel, but to herself. Daniel wasn't here because of guilt. He was here because he chose to be. Because this time, he wasn't running from responsibility or hiding behind distractions. And Claire wasn't the same woman who once left in silence. She was someone who had learned to fight. And now, she had something worth protecting more than ever. Not for herself, but for her daughter. And there was no force in the world that could take that from her. Daniel didn't move back in all at once. He didn't bring bags or boxes or make declarations. He just started showing up more often. First it was in the mornings, bringing coffee for Claire and hot chocolate for Alina before school. Then it was afternoons, helping with homework, picking up groceries, fixing the broken drawer in the kitchen that Claire had been ignoring for months. He didn't ask for anything in return. He didn't try to reclaim a space or force a routine. He just made himself useful, quietly, steadily, in a way that said, "I'm here. I'm not leaving." Claire noticed the small things first. The way Alina looked at Daniel when he laughed, like she was memorizing the sound. The way she stood closer to him now, instinctively. The way she whispered secrets to him at bedtime, giggling while he pretended to be shocked. Claire had spent years convincing herself that Alina didn't need a father. That love from one parent was enough if given fully, completely. But watching them now, watching Alina relax into this rhythm that had never existed before, she realized how wrong she'd been. It wasn't about needing. It was about deserving. Her daughter deserved both sides of the story, both halves of her heart. Daniel started cooking dinners 3 nights a week. He was surprisingly good at it, though Claire suspected he followed online tutorials secretly. He made spaghetti with real tomato sauce, chicken that didn't come from a can, and a kind of garlic rice that Alina said tasted better than her school lunch 5 times over. Mealtimes became something to look forward to, no longer silent or functional. They talked, they joked, they teased. Claire found herself smiling more. And when she caught Daniel looking at her across the table, sometimes just for a second too long, she looked back. They took Alina to the park on Sundays. Not a fancy one, just a small patch of green space 2 blocks away with an old swing set and a plastic slide. But to Alina, it was magic, especially when both her parents were there. She would race from one end to the other, calling out for them to watch. "Look, Dad, I can do it without holding on. Mom, take a picture." Claire would sit on the bench, and Daniel would stand nearby, phone in hand, capturing moments that neither of them had ever imagined getting back. Afterward, they'd stop for ice cream or pastries, and Alina would always insist on feeding them bites of hers, even if they had their own. She liked being in the middle. She liked being part of something that looked, at last, like a family. At home, Daniel didn't push Claire. He didn't try to bring up the past unless she did. He let her take the lead in every conversation that touched on old wounds. Some days, she was open, telling him stories about Alina's first day of school, or the time she caught the flu and wouldn't stop crying until Claire let her sleep on her chest. Other days, she shut down. Daniel respected both, but it didn't mean he wasn't watching. He saw the way she sometimes looked away when he stood too close, the way her hands hesitated to reach for his, the way she laughed but then quickly caught herself, like joy still felt like betrayal of some kind. He understood. Trust wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned. One evening, while Alina was asleep and Daniel was washing dishes, Claire stood in the doorway and watched him. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there. He sensed her presence, but didn't turn around. "You don't have to keep doing this," she finally said. He looked over his shoulder. "Doing what?" "This," she gestured vaguely. "Being here, fixing things, taking care of us." Daniel set a plate down gently. "I'm not fixing anything," he said. "I'm being present." "That's different." Claire leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "Why now? Why after all this time?" "Because I can," he said. "Because I want to, and because I never stopped loving you." She didn't respond right away. Then, quietly, she asked, "Do you regret it?" "Leaving?" he asked. "Everything," she said. Daniel shook his head. "I regret how we ended. I regret not fighting harder when you walked away. But I don't regret loving you. Or Alina. Not for a second." She nodded slowly. "I'm still angry sometimes, I know. And scared. I know that too." She stepped closer. "But it feels different now. Like maybe we could try again. Maybe not everything, but something." Daniel wiped his hands on a towel and faced her. "I'm not going anywhere, Claire. Whatever you're ready for, whenever that is, I'll be here." For the first time in years, she let herself believe as weeks passed. Claire began to notice something shift inside her. It wasn't sudden. It didn't come with fireworks or big announcements. It was more like a door quietly unlocking from the inside. She found herself sitting closer to Daniel on the couch, letting his arm brush against hers without flinching. She let him carry Alina when she fell asleep on movie nights, and once, when she was too tired to fight the warmth in her chest, she leaned against him and stayed there until the credits rolled. She caught herself humming again while doing the laundry, laughing harder, sleeping deeper. One night, after a long day of errands, Daniel stayed to help organize Alina's school supplies. She had a big project due and insisted on decorating her folder with glitter and stickers. Claire was exhausted, her hair messy, her eyes sore, but when Daniel looked at her, it was like he saw none of that. He saw only her, and when Alina, unprompted, called out, "Mom, Dad, look," they both paused, frozen. She'd never said that before. Not like that. Not with so much ease. Claire looked at Daniel, and this time she didn't look away. She just let it happen. There were bumps, of course. Moments when Claire panicked at how close they were getting again. Days when the memory of Rachel's insults echoed in her head, or when fear of abandonment crept in without warning. But Daniel was steady. Always. He never dismissed her fears. He met them. With honesty. With patience. With action. That mattered more than any apology could. One weekend, he invited them both to a small restaurant near the harbor. Nothing extravagant. Just a place with good food and soft music. Alina wore her nicest dress. Claire did too. And when they sat together in the booth, with the flicker of a candle between them, it didn't feel like a date. It felt like home. Daniel raised his glass of juice. To new beginnings. Alina raised hers eagerly. To chocolate cake. They all laughed. Claire clinked her glass against theirs. To this moment. After dinner, they walked along the water, hand in hand, the air quiet and cool. Daniel held Claire's fingers gently, not gripping, just touching, like a promise. And when she leaned her head on his shoulder, he didn't say anything. He just breathed her in, feeling the weight of the past start to melt. Back at the apartment, Claire tucked Alina in and kissed her forehead. "Are you happy?" she asked. Alina nodded sleepily. "The happiest I've ever been." Claire turned off the light and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to her daughter's breathing. Then she walked back into the living room, where Daniel sat, waiting. She sat beside him, her hand sliding into his without hesitation. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I am too," he said. She nodded. "But I want this." Daniel turned to her. "So do I." That night, for the first time since they'd been under the same roof again, she let him stay. Not just on the couch, but with her. No explanations. No guilt. Just warmth, skin to skin, breath to breath. They weren't trying to erase the past. They were building something new on top of it. Something stronger. Something that, this time, they wouldn't walk away from. The fever started in the middle of the night. Claire woke up to the sound of Alina's whimper, soft and strained. At first, she thought it was a bad dream, but when she touched her daughter's skin, she felt the heat instantly. Alarming, unnatural, spreading across her body like fire. "Alina," she whispered, shaking her gently. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" Alina blinked, barely, her breath shallow, lips dry. Claire didn't wait. She rushed for the thermometer, then the phone, and by the time Daniel stumbled out of the bedroom, still half asleep, Claire's voice was already breaking. "Her fever's 104.6, she said. "She's not responding." Daniel didn't ask questions. He grabbed a coat, picked Alina up in his arms, and said only one thing: "Let's go." The ride to the hospital was a blur. Claire sat in the back seat, holding Alina's hand, whispering prayers she didn't even realize she remembered. Daniel drove like a man possessed, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes locked on the road like nothing else existed. The emergency room lights were harsh and the paperwork endless, but the nurses moved fast. Alina was rushed into a room with oxygen and 4 fluids before Claire could even process what was happening. Daniel stayed at her side the entire time, answering questions, signing forms, calling in favors for a private pediatrician he knew, pulling strings until Alina was moved to a cleaner, quieter room upstairs. Claire didn't ask how he did it. She just held her daughter's hand and tried to breathe. The doctor came in an hour later with lab results. "It's dengue," he said, his tone calm but serious. "It's progressing, and her platelet count is dropping. We'll monitor her closely, and we've started treatment. But it's going to be a long few days." Claire nodded like she understood, but her mind had already gone numb. She sat at the edge of the hospital bed, brushing Alina's hair back, whispering her name over and over. Daniel stepped out to make another call, to his office, to explain he wouldn't be coming in for the rest of the week. He didn't wait for permission. He simply said, "I have to be here. My daughter needs me." For the next 2 days, they barely slept. Claire never left the room. Daniel took turns staying awake at night, watching the monitor, holding Alina's hand whenever she stirred. Nurses came and went, adjusting meds, bringing water, checking vitals. Time didn't move in hours anymore. It moved in platelet counts, in temperature readings, in the rising or falling of Alina's tiny chest. On the third day, her fever spiked again. Claire broke down. Right there, in the sterile hospital room under cold fluorescent lights, she crumbled to the floor. "I'm sorry," she cried, shaking, holding her knees to her chest. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you. I should have let you be your father from the beginning." Daniel knelt beside her, silent, letting her fall apart, letting her release all the years of guilt she had kept buried. "I thought I was protecting her," she said between sobs. "But I was protecting myself. From you. From being hurt again. And now look at her. She's in here, and I can't do anything. I failed her." Daniel put his arms around her, held her close. "You didn't fail her. You saved her, every day. You raised her with love. That's not failure. That's strength." Claire clung to him, crying into his shirt. "She should have had both of us. From the start. We're both here now," he said. "That's what matters." And he meant it. No blame. No bitterness. Just the simple, solid truth of the present. The next morning, Alina's fever began to drop. Slowly, carefully. The doctors were optimistic. Her platelet count stabilized. Claire and Daniel exhaled together for the first time in days. They took turns feeding her spoonfuls of broth, reading her stories, watching cartoons on the little hospital TV mounted high in the corner. Alina was weak, but her spirit was there. And when she smiled, really smiled, for the first time since arriving, Claire covered her face with both hands and cried again, this time in quiet relief. "You scared us, baby," she whispered. Alina reached for her hand. "I dreamed you were both there," she said. "And then I woke up, and you were." After a week in the hospital, Alina was discharged. Still pale, still fragile, but out of danger. Daniel carried her out of the building, her arms wrapped around his neck. Claire followed close, bags in hand, eyes red but bright. Daniel insisted they go to his apartment for recovery, a place more comfortable with space and sunlight and fewer stairs. Claire hesitated, but Alina begged. "Can we all stay together? Just until I feel better." Claire nodded. "Just until you're better," she said. But it didn't feel temporary. It felt right. Daniel cleared out the guest room for Alina, filled the fridge with Claire's favorite teas, adjusted the schedule of the housekeeper so things stayed tidy without being intrusive. Claire watched how easily he adapted to the rhythms of parenting, prepping warm towels, gently reminding Alina to take her meds, carrying her to the sofa when she was too tired to walk. He never complained. He never left the room when Claire needed a moment. He simply showed up, again and again. One evening, as Alina slept, Claire sat on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. Daniel joined her, handing her a cup of mint tea. "She's strong," he said, "just like you." Claire stared down at the steam rising from her cup. "I thought I was prepared for anything. I wasn't. The second I saw her in that hospital bed, I realized how breakable everything is." "It's not weakness to be scared," he said. "It's proof you care." She looked at him. "You never hesitated. Not once." "She's my daughter," he said simply. "So are you," she whispered. Daniel didn't respond. He just reached out and took her hand. That night, she didn't go back to the guest room. She slept beside him, head on his chest, heart quiet for the first time in years. It was quiet in the hospital room, the kind of quiet that comes not from absence, but from healing. Alina had fallen asleep, curled up beside the small stuffed fox Daniel had bought her from the gift shop downstairs. Claire sat beside the bed, her fingers gently stroking her daughter's hair, her other hand wrapped around a paper cup of tea long gone cold. Daniel stood by the window, watching the last light of day fade from the sky, the orange glow slipping into soft gray. Neither of them spoke for a while. They didn't need to. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of what they had been through, full of what they still hadn't said, full of all the things that had changed and all the things that hadn't. When Daniel finally turned around, his face was calm but focused. He crossed the room slowly, knelt down next to Claire's chair, and looked up at her. "I was going to wait," he said softly, "until we were home, until things felt more perfect. But maybe this is perfect in its own way." Claire looked at him, puzzled. "Wait for what?" Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't open it right away. He just held it there between them like something sacred. Not because she's ours. Not because we've already been through a marriage that didn't last. And not because of guilt or obligation or time. He took a slow breath. Because I still love you. Because I never stopped. Because when I see you, I see the rest of my life. Even when it's messy. Especially when it's messy. Claire stared at him, frozen. Daniel, he opened the box. Inside was a simple ring, delicate, gold with a tiny embedded stone, nothing grand. Just honest. Real. Will you marry me again? He asked. Not for Alina. Not for the past. For us. For the chance to write the next part differently. Claire blinked, her vision blurring as tears filled her eyes. For a long second, she didn't say anything. And then, slowly, she nodded. Yes. He smiled, his hands trembling as he slid the ring onto her finger. Yes, she repeated, this time laughing through the tears. Yes, you idiot. He stood up, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on like she had waited years to let go. From the bed, a groggy voice broke the moment. Are you guys kissing? Alina murmured, her eyes still closed. They both laughed. Not yet, Daniel said, brushing a kiss against Claire's temple. But soon. The wedding wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. They held it in a garden behind a friend's cafe on a warm Saturday morning. Alina wore a white dress and scattered flower petals down the aisle with the kind of joy that only a child who's been through too much and still believes in love can muster. Claire wore a soft ivory gown, her belly already starting to show. And Daniel, he didn't stop smiling. Not when she walked toward him, not when they said their vows, not when Alina stood between them and declared she now officially had a forever family. They kissed under an arch of simple wildflowers while friends clapped, and Alina shouted, Again! Do it again! Married life, the second time around, wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. They fought sometimes, about laundry, about bedtime routines, about Daniel burning toast, or Claire leaving shoes in the hallway. But they always circled back to the same place. Honesty, forgiveness, effort. They made time for each other. They made time for Alina. And when their son was born a year later, everything inside Claire shifted again. She held him in her arms, his face wrinkled and red, and felt something unlock. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a mother of two, a wife, a woman who had lost everything and found it again, piece by piece. They named him Noah. Alina took to him instantly. She declared herself Big Sister General and gave instructions to everyone in the house about how to hold him, how to warm his milk, how to not make weird baby voices that confuse his brain. Daniel listened to every word, even when he laughed behind his hand. Claire would sit by the crib sometimes and watch the three of them, her daughter playing protector, her husband humming lullabies, her son staring at the ceiling like it held all the answers. Their home wasn't filled with riches, but it was filled with peace. With music playing softly in the mornings, with stories read aloud in the evenings, with laughter echoing from the kitchen as Alina tried to teach her little brother how to giggle. Daniel often told Claire that the best part of his day was coming home. Not to a clean house or a hot meal, though those were nice, but to the feeling of being needed, of being wanted, of being part of something whole. One night, Claire sat on the couch nursing Noah while Alina snuggled beside her, half asleep with her head on Claire's leg. Daniel walked in carrying 2 mugs of tea and placed one gently beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Claire looked at him and smiled, the kind of smile that says, I see you. I know what we've been through, and I'm grateful. He leaned down, kissed the top of her head, then Alina's, then Noah's tiny fist. You're home, Claire whispered. Always, he said. Years passed. The kids grew, and so did they. They built new memories over old wounds. They held tight when things got hard. They celebrated loud when things went right. But most of all, they never stopped choosing each other. Every day, even when it wasn't easy. Especially when it wasn't easy. And if anyone ever asked Alina what saved her family, she'd say, without hesitation, a song, a stranger, and a second chance. Morning light filtered through the curtains in a way that didn't demand attention. It just gently arrived like most good things do. Claire stood in the doorway, holding her coffee with both hands, watching Alina zip up her little brother's backpack for the third time. "You forgot his snack," she said, half teasing. Alina rolled her eyes like a teenager in a 6-year-old's body. "Mom, I got it this time," she insisted, slipping a fruit pouch into the front pocket. Noah grinned up at her, still in that toddler wobble phase, and grabbed her hand the second she was done. "Let's go, big girl," he mumbled in a voice that barely pronounced his GS. Alina looked back at her mom. "I'm walking him today, remember?" Claire raised an eyebrow. "You're walking him to the gate. With supervision." Alina huffed, then turned to her dad, who stood by the garden fence, pulling weeds like it was some kind of therapy. "Tell her I could do it alone," she said. Daniel looked up, smirked. "You could do anything. But let's give it another year, Captain." Claire stepped out and joined him in the garden, barefoot in the grass. It had taken them months to save for this place. Modest, tucked at the end of a quiet lane, but it was theirs. The backyard wasn't big, but they had planted every flower together. They had picked every stone, built the little playhouse by hand. Everything that mattered was built with intention. Daniel leaned against the fence, dirt still on his fingers, and pulled her in gently with one arm. Claire rested her head on his shoulder. "Look at them," he said softly, eyes on Alina now, guiding Noah with both hands like he was glass. "She's so proud of him." Claire nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's proud of her too. You can see it." Daniel kissed her temple and let his voice drop just enough to say what had been sitting on his chest all morning. "Thank you for giving me another chance." Claire didn't answer at first. She just held him tighter, like silence was safer than words. But then she tilted her chin up, met his eyes, and said it quietly, simply, and without hesitation. "You earned it." They stood there for a long time, watching the two kids make their way down the path to the gate, Alina calling out instructions like she was the mayor of the world, Noah clumsily following like the best kind of shadow. And Claire remembered the train. She remembered the man with sad eyes, the girl with the missing teeth, the sickness, the secrets, the fights, the tears. But more than anything, she remembered the choice, the moment she decided to let someone back in, and how that decision, simple, small, became everything. Later that evening, after dinner and homework and baths, Alina climbed into bed and pulled her blanket up to her nose. "Can I ask something?" she said, her voice low. Claire sat beside her and nodded. "Of course. Did you know right away that Dad would be your forever again?" Claire smiled. "No, I was scared, really scared." Alina considered that. "But you still picked him." "I did. Because love doesn't disappear just because things get hard. Sometimes it hides, but it waits." Alina nodded like she understood more than she should. "Good," she whispered, "because I really like our life now." Claire kissed her forehead. "Me too, sweetheart." Down the hall, Daniel was rocking Noah back and forth in the nursery, singing under his breath. Claire walked in just as he was placing him in the crib. Daniel turned, met her in the doorway, and they stood there for a while. No words, just a quiet knowing that after everything, they had come back home. To each other, to their children, to themselves. Because not all separations are forever. And sometimes, if love still lives quietly beneath the hurt, the road back can still exist. Thank you for being part of this journey. If this story moved you in any way, please consider subscribing to Cracks of Light, leaving a comment below, and sharing this with someone who still believes in second chances. Your support helps these stories reach more hearts. Because somewhere out there, someone might be waiting for their way home too. And maybe, just maybe, love will lead them back. See you in the next one.